Since coming to CMU, Jeff has been active in developing courses and program in international business and in economic development, including courses that offer experience-based learning opportunities for students abroad. His interests particularly have included research partnerships with microfinance organizations studying their impact in addressing poverty issues, particularly in Latin America. Jeff also teaches courses in global business, and he will be leading a learning tour this spring to Europe, looking at economic and political integration in the European Union. Jeff holds an MBA from the University of Calgary, a Bachelor of Commerce from UBC, and has had a couple of opportunities to study business in overseas contexts as well. Brings a strong sense of corporate experience as well to the business faculty, having spent over a decade in business consulting, strategic planning, and in marketing. Jeff's topic, as you know this evening, is entitled The European Debt Crisis and Other Wonders Hiding in the Global Economy. Jeff, we're grateful for your willingness to engage what is a big topic and want to welcome you, please, to come forward and lead us in this conversation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Terry. I appreciate that. And we've got our technical problems resolved here, so we're good to go. And I want to congratulate everybody who's here tonight on making it out in minus 27 weather, or whatever it is, minus 45, I think, with the wind chill. It's a little bit unfortunate, the cold and the snow, but it's good to have you out. You must be dedicated if you come out in weather like that to hear a talk about economics and a debt crisis, so good for you. As Terry mentioned, this talk actually spawns out of a course that we're teaching and offering here at the Redekop School of Business at CMU, entitled Business in the European Union. And the course, in fact, meets on Thursday evenings during this exact time slot, and so the participants from the class are here tonight, and I'll have a few of them joining me up front for a panel discussion a little bit later on in the presentation, and I'll introduce them to you at that point. As part of the course, as a complement to the winter term seminar, we're offering a study tour as well, entitled Business in Europe, and it's a 2-week spring study tour looking at the European Union, spending a week in Western Europe, looking at the EU institutions and a number of businesses, but also politics, economics, and culture, and then heading to Eastern Europe as well, to the Baltic countries, and that's going to be happening at the end of April and the first couple of weeks of May. So it's something that involves our students, but also people from the community, the wider community as well. So the outline for my discussion, I'll call it a discussion tonight rather than a presentation, is going to be 3 or 4 different parts. For the first maybe 20 minutes or half an hour, I'd like to kind of walk through some aspects for you and sort of open the discussion with a bit of a talk or a presentation on what are some of the financial crises that have happened in the global economy in the last couple of years. And we'll walk through those, 3 of those, and following that, or towards the end of that, I'm going to invite a couple people from our participants from our class to come join me for a panel discussion about some aspects of the financial crisis as we're walking through them. And then towards the end, I've got some questions for the group to discuss, the audience to discuss as well. And we'll have a couple of handouts and ask you to engage with us in the wider discussion about the debt crisis, what it is, where it's heading to, and sort of what it means, and our sort of perceptions and perspectives on it as well. So let me start with sort of a background, if you will, on or setting the stage for our discussions tonight, talking about 3 different types or 3 different names for crises that have happened in the last couple of years. The first one is what's been called the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis. We'll start with that and talk about what that is, or what that was. And that sort of morphed into something called the financial crisis, more generally, although it was sort of a different aspect to it. And I'll walk through that as well. And the third part of it is the crisis in Europe. That is the title for our presentation, which is what's commonly called the Euro debt crisis, even though it's probably more appropriately called the European sovereign debt crisis. And so we'll walk through what each of those mean and give you some background. So if we take the context of, let's say, early to mid 2000, before the what's called sort of the pre and post crisis is often terminology that's used in the business world these days. So early to mid 2000s, there was a sustained period of rising real estate prices, particularly in the United States. There was sort of boom times, if you will, and economic growth was doing well. People were buying real estate, buying homes with the anticipation and hope of raising equity, having increasing house prices. Banks were busy doing good business lending. Mortgage lenders were out there lining up mortgages or selling mortgages to customers and to clients, and times were good. And with the idea of, or with the cycle of home prices going up and up, people were getting more and more exuberant about the idea of being able to own homes, own multiple homes, speculate on homes, and to make some good investment profits on real estate. And as the euphoria built over time, the financial incentive to continue doing that was also there. And banks and mortgage brokers in particular were earning fees from this, and you could almost say to a point it became a stage of almost predatory lending, if you want to use that term, where they were looking for almost anybody and anybody who might qualify for purchasing a home and offering them a mortgage. And the term subprime mortgage is something that I'll just explain and walk through. What does that mean? What does that look like? Because it's key to our understanding of the initial sort of origins of the U.S. crisis. The idea behind a subprime mortgage was that it was issued to customers who were sort of less than prime credit risk quality, I guess you might say. And it was often with little or no money down, sometimes with no employment required, or at least no checks, employment checks and credit checks. And the key to it was that it usually came with an introductory low interest offer. So for a period of months, or usually even a couple of years, 1 to 2 years, someone could buy a home in the States for very little money down, or sometimes no money down. You have a mortgage where you're paying interest only, no principal, and at very reduced rates. But the catch was, after a couple of years, the interest rates would go up quite dramatically. But the selling line went that you didn't need to worry about that, because as home prices kept going up, you would earn equity in your home just by owning it for the first year or two. You would then be able to refinance or remortgage that home before the interest rate promotional period expired and the higher rates kicked in, and you would then have equity. You'd magically have equity that you could withdraw to then actually be able to afford the payments in the first place. Because if you couldn't afford them in the first place, through some sort of fancy application magic, you might be able to still get your mortgage, subprime mortgage, and then be able to afford it later once you could withdraw your equity. So that was happening on fairly large scale with, as I mentioned before, little or no money down, sometimes without any credit checks or even employment required as part of that. The scheme works if housing prices continue to rise, but what happens when they level off or they begin to fall? And that's exactly where the problems began to materialize, is when the cycle of increasing home prices began to level off and decline. There's another component to understand the crisis, though. Banks that were lending these mortgages, they were only able to lend a certain percentage of their ratio of their overall capital. And when they would reach those upper limits, there would be restrictions on how much they could lend. But there was sort of a creative way to then spin these mortgages off in what's called collateralization or securitization, where they would bundle these mortgages together in large groups, and the asset behind the mortgage was a home. Someone was paying on that mortgage, and so the idea was there was a revenue stream, so long as the lender was making their payments. And these mortgages were bundled together and sold to other investors, sold to other banks, sold to hedge funds, sold to international investors, insurance companies. And as a result, banks were then able to recapitalize, if you were, and then turn around and sell even more mortgages, because now they've offloaded some of these mortgages in the form of assets. And as well, the credit ratings on these mortgages also were no longer subprime. They actually were considered sort of fairly stable or not so high risk investment quality grade. And so you had a lot of these subprime mortgages that were now being bundled, and in some ways almost masked, as being higher quality investment assets and sold around the world. As prices began to fall, though, borrowers could no longer afford to continue making their payments, especially when the higher interest rates kicked in and the promotional period was over. They would then run into defaults. And if you weren't able to make your mortgage payment, you would default on your mortgage. At a period in time, the bank may foreclose. You'd have foreclosures, and then prices for homes would start to decline even greater, because you had this vicious cycle of defaults, foreclosures, and prices dropping. And because a lot of people were caught up with the subprime mortgage situation, it exacerbated the cycle, and you had a period of very rapidly declining home prices. A lot of people began to find themselves underwater, what we call the term for having no equity or negative equity in your home. Even people who weren't involved in the subprime mortgage situation. Homeowners who perhaps might have been good credit history, owned their home for a couple of years, but with the decline in prices, 10, 20% or more, found themselves underwater. As borrowers stopped making the payments, the value of these investments also started to erode. So we had these bundled or collateralized groups of mortgages that were sold all over the world to different investing groups, and the value of those assets is different when the people are no longer making payments, as opposed to when you're projecting the value of the sum total of the payments you would receive as an investor. The problem was nobody knew what these assets would then be worth if you had defaults happening at a rapid rate. People also didn't know how many there were or who was holding them. And so as a result, trust in borrowers to repay was eroded. And that's the first aspect where we introduced the principle of trust. The fact that the system overall and collectively, people could no longer trust if borrowers are going to be paying back on their mortgages. And from this, that then spun out what we call the global financial crisis, which was related but somewhat different. The eroding capital and the impaired balance sheet from holding these subprime assets investments led to a wave of bankruptcies of subprime mortgage firms, banks, and hedge funds. By September 2008, Lehman Brothers, which was a very well-known, well-established investment banking firm, went bankrupt. And that sent shockwaves around the world globally. At the same time, Merrill Lynch, another investment firm, was rescued in a buyout, and a large insurance company called AIG Insurance was in need of an $85 billion bailout, rescued by the US government. The combination of these three significant economic bailouts and shocks created significant concern and distress in markets around the world. Stock markets began to crash, and here we now had a situation where trust in the stability of banks was eroded. And the problem was nobody knew which banks owned how much of this subprime mortgage that had been bundled and collateralized that was now not worth as much as it was before, or perhaps even worthless. And so you had companies that had balance sheets where they looked good on paper in terms of their assets, but people weren't sure what the actual legitimate capitalization or financial health of these banks was like. As a result, banks stopped lending to each other and to other companies. And this caused, which led to the crisis to spread to other industries besides just the financial industry. Firms did not have access to credit when their loans came due, and so the financial crisis really became a situation where credit started to freeze up, and not only banks but also other industries found themselves not able to access credit, not able to roll over loans or commercial lending vehicles when they came due, and also found themselves in a liquidity crunch, which led to bankruptcy. In October of 2008, the US government approved a $700 billion bailout package for banks. At the same time, the UK government in Europe and a few other ones also engaged in a number of bailouts. It went beyond that. You had bailouts of large automakers, if you recall that as well. There was a term called too big to fail, where there were some companies that the government decided were too large to let fail because of the impact on the economy during times of recession and distress. where there'd be too many unemployed people coming onto the ranks of the unemployed and leaving the workforce. So General Motors and Chrysler were two of the sort of more well-known names that were bailed out. The U.S. Federal Reserve, or the central bank, also engaged in something called quantitative easing, or QE for short, where they started to buy up these subprime mortgage-backed assets that nobody else wanted to buy. And they were doing that in order to create, to provide capital to banks that were in a liquidity crunch, and to try to unfreeze the credit markets, so companies could have access to credit. At the end of 2008 in December, there was an unprecedented coordinated rate cut amongst all the central banks of the G8, where they cut the interest rates down to almost zero in an effort to try to stimulate lending, borrowing, and to try to unfreeze the credit markets. Into the next year, 2009, the U.S. government passed a $750 billion stimulus plan to try to boost the economy by spend their way out of the recession and the crash. And as a result, you had rapidly rising deficits. Canada did the same, Europe as well, as governments borrowed money to fund bailouts and stimulus spending programs to prevent economic collapse and a prolonged recession. The result was something called socialization of debt. So as a result, you were shifting private debts from banks, from individual companies, from the private sector onto the balance sheets of governments. As a result, a year later, or in 2011, got to the point where, for the first time in history, the U.S. credit rating was downgraded by one of the rating firms, S&P. And it was the first time that had happened. People were quite worried about what the shock might be from that as well. The U.S. was borrowing a lot of money. They were already in debt a lot, and they had something called a debt ceiling. They tried to legislate themselves into a ceiling or cap on debt. And they raised that repeatedly over the last number of years, and it stands at about $17 trillion right now, which is quite high, to say the least. U.S. government debt levels skyrocketed from about 60% in the 60s or so as a percentage of GDP to about 100 now today. 100% of their GDP is equivalent to their debt. Canada also initiated some stimulus spending. We called it our action plan, I think the government called it. It's a great euphemism for it. And their budget surplus that we had been running for about a decade quickly turned into a deficit. National debt began to grow again for the first time in a number of years. So that was the financial crisis. From that, caused a lot of distress globally, but we'll now move to the main focus of our topic for tonight, which is the European or the EU debt crisis. Financial crisis had an impact across the Atlantic and Europe, and I'm going to play a short video for you here, just to introduce paint the picture here in about 2 minutes. This video is taken from a series called Great Decisions on PBS, and this one is called Imperfect Union, the Eurozone in Crisis, and it's just a 2-minute trailer or promotion for the longer video, which is about half an hour or so.
In 2009, the EU began to buckle under the pressure of the international credit crisis.
The 08-09 financial panic, crash, Great Recession put tremendous economic financial pressure on the entire global economy, including Europe. Europe suffered a worse economic downturn than the United States. A loss of GDP, unemployment soared into the double digits.
We started calling what's happening now the Eurozone debt crisis, essentially in May 2010, which is when Greece received its first bailout funded by the International Monetary Fund and Eurozone countries. And since then, the crisis has spread throughout the Eurozone to several other countries, Ireland, then Portugal, now Spain and Cyprus, and reaching Italy, and has mutated from a strictly sovereign debt government crisis to a banking crisis and a sort of sectoral crisis.
The origins of the European debt crisis are multiple. The proximate cause was the fact that many countries recently have had a large increase in budget deficits and their stocks of public debt to levels that are unsustainable. In some countries, this was due to bad fiscal behavior, too much spending, too little taxes, like in Greece. But in other parts of the Eurozone, like Spain or Ireland, the problem was that there was a bubble in real estate and housing, When the bubble burst, the countries went into a recession. When there is a recession, your deficit increased, then you have to bail out banks, financial institutions, and the private losses get socialized. It happened even in the US, and then you have a surge of public debt.
These bubbles, either in government spending or in the banks or in the property sector, were essentially fueled by what tends to always drive crises in human history, which is hubris and excess.
So, that video helps us understand, sort of in a quick snapshot, a little bit about what the Euro debt crisis was about. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just walking through it in a little bit more detail. And I'll start with, I'll take a step backwards and explain a little bit about what is the EU, the European Union itself, and that's something that we focus on in the course that we are offering here at CMU. The European Union is a political project as much as it is an economic one, about economic integration and political integration. It has its origins coming out of World War II, with the idea that the European Union countries would become so integrated and interdependent amongst themselves, economically and politically, that the idea of going to war would be impossible again. Also that Europe could rebuild and reestablish its place on the world stage. So the idea of linking the European Union countries together, economically and politically, through greater and greater integration to provide political stability and prevent war. The EU itself is built on a series of treaties that date back to the 1950s with the inception of the European Union. And each of the treaties that came along would add more and more scope of integration and more regulation, or areas of policy. In 1991, the treaty that was commonly called at the time the Maastricht Treaty, or was subsequently renamed the Treaty on European Union, laid out the plans for something called EMU, Economic and Monetary Union, so the acronym EMU. And this actually laid the groundwork for the creation of the euro currency itself. A single currency for all of Europe was the goal and the vision for down the road. The euro itself came into existence in 1999 through electronic trading only for a couple of years, and then it became an actual physical currency with banknotes and coins in 2002. So that's the lifespan of the euro. It's only been around for less than 20 years as an actual currency. As part of that process leading up to it, there was something called the convergence criteria. And that's where the countries in the European Union needed to somehow integrate their economies and integrate their economic policies, especially around things like interest rates, inflation, economic growth, unemployment levels, but also especially around deficits, so how much money they would borrow each year, and total debt, national debt that accrues from year to year. Another component or institution that was created as a result of the treaty was the European Central Bank, the ECB for short. It was established to actually manage the monetary system, to manage all of the Eurozone and the financial aspects as part of it. With that came control over what we call monetary policy. Monetary policy is a government's ability to control the supply of money and also to control, through that as a tool, interest rates. How much or how expensive it is to borrow money or not in an economy. But the problem was there wasn't political will at the time for governments to also give up what we call fiscal policy, and that's control over taxation and spending. So while you had one currency and a central bank, a European central bank, that was managing interest rates and was managing the euro as a currency itself for all of Europe, the European Union itself didn't have supranational control or sovereignty over the spending habits of each of the EU member states. Each of the countries still retained control over how much they could spend, including deficits and debt. To counter that, or to try to keep that in check, there was a development called the Stability and Growth Pact, the SGP. In 1998, it was to act as a guideline to manage deficits and debt for the member states so they wouldn't get out of hand. And it wasn't part of the sort of core treaties per se, but rather a piece of legislation intended to try to keep control of this area of fiscal policy that was not where the sovereignty still resided with each of the nation states. The Stability and Growth Pact stipulated that annual deficits couldn't be higher than 3% per year and total national debt of 60%. And this is a ratio, a percentage ratio of the size of the economy measured in GDP, gross domestic product. Initially, Germany was a champion of the Stability and Growth Pact. Germany was worried that countries would start to spend too much and get into too much debt. So they were a champion of that. And initially, there was some discussion about trying to enact or enforce the Stability and Growth Pact when countries like Portugal and Greece were looking at going beyond those amounts. But what happened in 2005 is there was a little bit of a change or a shift. And that's when Germany itself and France started to also run into problems, going above these deficit limits. And as a result, there was pressure put on by France and Germany to actually revise the Stability and Growth Pact and to loosen it, to make it not quite so stringent. Their violations were not enforced, but it also sort of laid the framework or paved the way, if you will, for the future debt crisis, because in essence, the signal went out that the Stability and Growth Pact was not going to be enforced, and countries then started to go above the spending limits on the deficit side or on the total debt side. And this is actually what led to the Eurozone debt crisis. The exact scenario that the Stability and Growth Pact and the convergence criteria were intended to prevent. The Eurozone debt crisis began in May of 2010 with the first bailout of Greece by the IMF and by other Eurozone countries. It spread to Ireland, Portugal, Spain in the form of their banks, to Cyprus most recently, and Italy has also come up in the news as a potential country for a bailout. The worry was something called a threat of what we call contagion. And the worry with contagion was, what if the problem spreads beyond just Greece itself? So people were concerned that Greece as a country might default on their debts. And if they're in the Eurozone, it would impact everybody else, all the other countries that are in the Euro. Other countries might follow. So at the end of the day, people weren't immediately concerned so much about Greece, because while their economy is perhaps a $250 billion, which sounds like a lot, within the context of Europe, it's actually one of the smaller countries. The worry was that the contagion would spread to other countries instead. And countries with larger economies, like Spain in particular, and Italy. With that, the idea that the euro might fail, or that a country might default and withdraw from the euro, and that this could spread, led to a crisis of confidence in the euro currency itself. So once again, there's eroding trust, causing the global financial system to potentially crash if this were to happen. That was the concern overall with the euro debt crisis. I'll give you an idea here for some of the country debt levels. I mentioned before that the Stability and Growth Pact, which is the red line, indicated that the upper limit would be 60% of a country, proportionally as a ratio, that a country's proportion of their debt to their GDP. This particular graph is from 2010, 2011, the time of the crisis, to give you an idea of where things were at the time. And you see Greece already at close to 160% of their GDP in the form of debt, far beyond the 60% limit outlined by the Stability and Growth Pact. Italy at 120, Ireland 112, Portugal 102, Belgium, France, Germany. We see a lot of countries here already sort of above. Again, this is 5 years later, 6 years later after the revision when the Stability and Growth Pact was loosened because countries were starting to run into some trouble. The next graph is a little bit sort of shows on the left-hand side, the previous slide showed national debt overall as a total. The left side shows deficits for 2011, 2012. And you can see where countries like Ireland were adding 10.5% per year of their GDP to the debt. Greece, 9.5%. Spain, 6%. Portugal, 6%. And the graphs to the right show projections going forward of how that was going to, it was spiking up, but it was going to, at least they hoped, it was going to level off and come back down. So as I mentioned before, the worry was contagion. What if it's not just Greece? What if Greece defaults, but it starts to a chain reaction where other countries now default? And here, again, what I'll mention or highlight is we're talking about sovereign debt. So we're talking about the debt that countries take on, primarily their federal governments, when they run deficits over a period of time to be able to afford spending within the economy, government spending. But where do they borrow the money from? Who holds the bonds or the debt of sovereign nations? It's banks, primarily, commercial banks. And in the European context here, the Greek debt was held by a lot of banks in Germany, France, the UK, Ireland, Portugal, Spain. It was the same scenario, a different makeup in terms of which countries in Europe the banks were from primarily that were holding the debt. But it was the same kind of scenario as what happened in the US, where now all of a sudden the trust and confidence of the financial viability and stability of the banks in Europe was being called into question. And as a result, there was a lack of trust in the overall system. Nobody knew which banks were holding the debt or how much of it for which countries. And if these countries started to default and no longer made their payments, it would be the same scenario as what happened in the US when the subprime mortgage lenders could no longer make their payments. And when you had debt in the form, an asset in the form of a mortgage, it wasn't worth as much if people aren't paying it. Well, if you were holding an asset as a bank in Europe in the form of a debt or a bond from a particular country in Europe, and they can no longer make their payments or stop making their payments, the value of that asset is eroded. And so trust and confidence, once again, is brought to a standstill. It became an existential question for the Eurozone as a political project. If the euro itself fails, if it implodes, if countries start pulling out, and that's one of the capstone pieces politically and economically for Europe as a whole and the European Union. What if the European Union overall starts to collapse? What if all of these treaties over the period of decades start to erode and get reversed and the whole system collapses? And so it was a significant worry for Europe, not just economically, but also politically. As a result, it caused a lot of stress in the financial system, especially coming just a couple of years after the financial crisis in the US and the subprime mortgage crisis. Also, up until 2009, with something called the Treaty of Lisbon, the European Union treaties did not even address the issue of how a member state might actually withdraw from the EU or from the Eurozone. There wasn't a process in place for countries to withdraw. There was a very detailed process for how countries joined the European Union, but not for how they might pull out from it or from the Eurozone. And so the worry was that there would be a fear of a sudden default, or what we call a messy exit from the Eurozone by Greece. And it became coined in the popular media as a Grexit, a Greece exit from the Eurozone. The treaties also, at the time, also prohibited the European Union itself from bailing out any member states. So the EU as a whole could not provide bailout funding, at least initially, to individual member states that got themselves in trouble. Individual countries could, but that was dealt with at a national level, and they, of course, would have to debate that in their own parliaments or seats of government and get that approved through votes as well, which is pretty difficult to do with governments when you're talking about spending taxpayers' money in one country and giving it to another country as a bailout. Subsequently, the treaties were eventually revised to allow for some steps to move forward. So I'm going to move now into a section here called Steps Forward. European debt crisis. What steps has Europe taken to try to address this euro debt crisis that was sort of at its height a couple of years ago? And what I'll do is I'm going to invite up a couple people now. I mentioned before, a couple participants from my class that will join me here for a panel discussion. I want to introduce, maybe if the three of you want to come up. I've got Will Bolender is a student of ours, an international student from Germany. He came to us a year ago. He's resided in Canada for a couple of years, but Will grew up in Germany for most of his life. And he's going to provide some perspective for us in a couple of minutes, talking about the euro debt crisis from a citizen perspective in Germany and how Germans have perceived that. Jonas is another student of ours who's in the European Union business course. And as part of the course, one of the requirements is to actually have each student take on one of the countries in Europe and focus on that country, become familiar with it, do a lot of research, and sort of become the champion for that country. Jonas chose Greece, which is an interesting country to talk about for tonight. And so I'll have a discussion with Jonas a little bit later in the presentation about where is Greece at now, and what's the state of Greece through the debt crisis. I'm going to invite up Norm Klippenstein as well. Norm is a participant in the course. He is taking it out of interest. Come on up, Norm. Norm is a value investor from Niverville in southern Manitoba, and he's quite interested, like myself. You know, maybe we'll move one of the chairs over to this side. Let's do that. Okay. And why don't we just slide the one chair over, Norm, and you can have a seat if you'd like. Norm's a value investor, and I think it'll be interesting to have a conversation with him about how have things changed from his perspective when we're talking about value in the marketplace and we're talking about investing, and what sort of shock and disevil, I guess you might say, has resulted from the financial crisis. So I'm going to talk to Norm a little bit later in the presentation. What I'll do right now is I'm going to start to walk through some of the steps that have been taken by the European Union to try to address the debt crisis, and then I'll start my conversation with Will, and then we'll move to Jonas a little bit after that. The first thing is something called what's now called the European Stability Mechanism. Basically, Europe realized that there was probably no other course of action other than to try to bail out Greece, something that the treaties overall prohibited, but was deemed to be necessary. And so steps were taken in 2010 to create something initially called the European Financial Stability Facility. It was supposed to be temporary at the time, and it was funded by the countries in Europe, the European Union, largely by Greece and by Germany and a large number of the other wealthy countries, and it became permanent. A permanent fund called the European Stability Mechanism. It's now funded upwards has an upward funding limit of $1 trillion as a backstop in case the debt crisis becomes more acute. And it's been initiated a number of times to offer bailouts to help countries meet their debt requirements or their debt payments when they're no longer able to access capital or credit through the commercial markets in the form of bonds and debt. In particular, Greece, Portugal, and Ireland are three countries that have accessed this fund, and Spain also in the form of their banks. It's not necessarily a popular thing, though, across Europe, because you have a situation where you've got citizens who are being asked to use taxpayer money, their taxpayer money, to allow their governments to contribute these funds, billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, to a bailout fund that then goes to other member states in within the EU and within the Eurozone. And so I want to talk first with Will about that. And we've had some brief conversations in preparation for our discussion tonight, with the focus being, from a citizen perspective, in Germany, how do Germans perceive the financial crisis and this idea of creating a bailout fund to bail out countries like Greece and others to help them make it through this financial crisis and the default on their loans?
So Jeff, as you mentioned already, the bailouts were actually held by a couple of countries, and as it happened, Germany was one of the main net creditors with approximately holding 27% of the bailouts, so which was kind of like a lot of money. And now certainly there are many different perspectives, right, in Germany among the public citizens in Germany on what like Germany's stance is in the net crisis. But like I will be just talking about more from a general perspective. So, I mean, most of the people I knew, or most of the people who are like, the general public, they maybe don't know too much about, economics or the European Union agenda, or, if they're not interested in politics. So it's just interesting, to see how they don't know too much about it. But what they know is the bailouts hurt, right? So you could see that they are taxpayers, and the funds came out of their pocket, and they felt it in their paycheck, and they saw the results as well, because the funds, which was like the money which went to, let's say, the pigs like Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, like the money which went to them for the bailouts was actually supposed to go for, let's say, infrastructure in Germany, like renewal of just boosting the German economy. So they were kind of like hurt by it, which is bad for them, right? So they knew that. Then the other thing is, Germany as a country, they how should I say it, after the reunification or after World War II, they were very fiscally prudent, and they did everything in order to, boost their economy, build it up, and have a good economy. And that's why they were in a position later on where they are actually like the leader in the European Union, being like the economic booster, right, in the European Union. So, however, most Germans think that other countries like Greece, or let's say Portugal, didn't really do that throughout the 20 years, when Germany was suffering. But like Greece was kind of like chilling and going like into, pension after 40 and stuff like that, right? So now most Germans think, why would we support them for, what they did in the past,
So
which is nothing, right?
You have like a fundamental tension between the citizens of Germany feeling like it's sort of their money being used in other countries, and there's been sort of a disconnect in terms of economic activity and whatnot.
Exactly. So that's the biggest problem there right now. So, and then the other thing is, as I mentioned, they're feeling they're just sick and tired of it, right? They're like kind of complaining about it. But then the biggest problem with it is, as I said, the general public is kind of against all those bailouts because they feel hurt by it.
Right.
But then the elite in Germany, like the politicians and stuff, they can't just get out of the European Union or whatever because they're too deep into it right now, right? With 27% of holding of the funds and stuff like that, if they would, it's just, there's two extremes now, being for it or against it. So now it's just about how to reconcile those two extremes, right? So.
Right, so Germany's at the core of the European Union. They've spent decades investing in it, coming out of World War II, rehabilitating their image and their place within the European Union, becoming the economic engine and heart of it again. And that they have so much invested in the European Union itself that it's not really a discussion to talk about sort of walking away, even though the crisis is building and building. And yet there's resentment at the citizen level. And it makes for interesting, I imagine, domestic politics in Germany, when, especially if you're running for re-election, to try to propose that Germany go along with a bailout of German taxpayer money, and at the same time trying to espouse some of the benefits of it at the same time. Good, and thank you for that, Will. Maybe what I'll do is I'll talk just briefly about one or two of the benefits that Germany actually received or was a beneficiary of in joining the Eurozone overall. There's a couple of points we can probably highlight. One is the fact that as an economic powerhouse, generally what happens over time, to kind of simplify things, is if you are a strong producer and a strong exporter, the value of your currency goes up over time. And Germany, to some degree, has benefited from having a relative to their situation, I wouldn't call it deflationary, but rather a lower currency value than they would otherwise if they had just their own Deutschmark. And that's kept their competitiveness in a better situation internationally and globally, where you've got a euro currency value with 18 member states rather than Germany just on its own, and the value of the currency going up. The second part, or another aspect of the benefit to Germany, is they have access to markets across all of the EU, including into Greece, and including into Spain and Portugal and Ireland and all these different countries. And so some of the debt that's been accrued for under the sovereign debt of each of those countries was actually used for government spending on different goods and services, some of which are provided by German industries, or perhaps even quite a bit, a fair amount, given the size of Germany's economic situation. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit now and talk about Greece. Greece also benefited to some extent, or in a number of ways, from the Eurozone, even though they're feeling a lot of the pain of it right now. For a number of years prior to the financial crisis, the interest rates that Greece could borrow at were quite low. Prior to 1999 or early 2000s, when Greece joined the Eurozone itself, when Greece had the drachma, and they were still with their own currency, they were independent, their interest rates for borrowing were quite high because they were in trouble financially already then at that point in time, and the interest rates were in the double-digit amounts, which is quite a bit to pay as a country to borrow funds. They benefited by the fact that joining the Eurozone brought some stability, brought some confidence, and their interest rates for borrowing went down to the low single digits, almost the same amount as Germany. And so you have a country like Greece borrowing at the same rates as an economic powerhouse like Germany for a number of years. And if you look at graphs and charts from that time period, what you see is that it starts, they follow each other for a number of years, and they start to diverge again right about the time of the crisis. So when the trust starts to get eroded again, all of a sudden people start to think maybe Greece might actually pull out and default. All of a sudden their interest rates start to skyrocket. It gets to the point where they're no longer able to even access credit. Companies and banks will not buy their bonds anymore on the market. But before that, they benefited from lower interest rate. Another way that Greece benefited was the fact that they had access to something called cohesion funds. So one of the more recent treaties in the European Union introduced the idea of what we'd call transfer payments here in Canada. So taking money and moving it from having all countries contribute into a fund at the European Union, and then using those funds to help build up the poorer regions of Europe in the form of infrastructure, roads, transportation, communications, things of that nature. And Greece has been a beneficiary of the cohesion funds as well. I want to turn now to Jonas and ask you, Jonas, to talk to us a little bit about what have you found in your research about Greece. In the last couple of weeks you've been researching them. How is Greece doing right now? Where are they at economically, and what are some of the main issues or hot topic discussions happening in the country itself, politically and domestically?
Okay, well, Will, you mentioned the Germans don't like the bailouts very much. I've got good news for you, neither do the Greeks. So, yeah, like Jeff said, I've been researching Greece for the past couple of weeks, just kind of generally their situation there, and I've found some interesting notes from the citizen perspective. As we've gone through, Greece initially received a bailout of 100 billion euros in 2010, and when that failed to stabilize their economy, they actually received an additional bailout a couple years later of 130 billion euros. So we're talking quite a bit of debt, and the IMF is actually currently in Athens negotiating an additional bailout package, essentially so that Greece can make its debt payments. So now we're talking kind of lumping debt on top of debt. And the situation there is pretty severe. We saw estimates earlier of about 156% of GDP in 2011 for the percentage of Greek debt. The estimates are now as high as 180% of GDP for the debt level in Greece, which is just incredible. And so Germany is putting a lot of pressure on Greece to speed up austerity measures that have been introduced the last couple of years, partially through IMF conditions. But the Greek citizens especially are starting to say, you know, we've had all we can take. Like, the situation is not getting better here. And specifically with young people being unemployed, the rates for people under 25 being unemployed is sitting at about 60% right now, which is just severe. And in a profile piece I was reading on the unemployment crisis for young people in Greece, it's noting that people in their late 20s and mid 30s are moving back in with their parents. So, you know, we students here in Canada think we've got it bad. I think they've got it worse. And in an extreme case I read, there are universities that are firing security guards that don't have a master's degree or a PhD. So there's just incredible credential inflation going on that really speaks to the kind of the desperation of the situation there. But the current governing coalition there in Greece is said to be rather fragile, but they remain pro-bailout. They want to appease the IMF and their European creditors and go along with these austerity measures. So there's kind of this tension breeding at the citizen level of the citizens also not trusting their government, but also not trusting their creditors and kind of being fed up with all this debt. So it's interesting to kind of think about what's going to happen, and I've done a little bit of research and reading around that too. The government is currently working on decreasing barriers to competition and liberalizing the economy, and the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has recommended Greece start focusing more on exports and production in their economy. So there is a certain stream of thought going that way, but then there's a left-wing political party in Greece called Syriza, who are very anti-bailout and want to put Greece first, and they are arguing for debt relief, that the European Union should kind of absorb some of the debt back and forgive the Greek debt because it's becoming unmanageable. And they have even not so much threatened, but suggested that if things got much worse and they were to gain power in Greece, that they would cut off debt service payments to their creditors in favor of meeting Greek needs first. And while that position is not advocated for by most international observers, there are some, especially in a Business Week editorial that I was reading, that just essentially say, enough is enough. The Greek debt is far too big to handle, and the European Union needs to recognize its mistake in giving such massive bailouts and kind of hand Greece some debt relief. So there is a fair bit of that tone going on as well. But the situation continues, and the IMF's goal to have a new bailout program in place of about probably 20 billion euros, their deadline or their goal to have that in place is March the 10th, so coming up quick. Stay tuned, I suppose. It's interesting times there in Greece.
So you said 60% unemployment rate for youth. Is that what you had mentioned before?
That's correct, yeah, under 25.
Under 25. So you can imagine the job prospects coming out of university and whether people would want to put the money, which they may not have to start with, into a university education and borrowing, getting into debt with student loans, when your prospects for employment are less than half, less than stellar to say the least. So interesting. Thank you for that, Jonas. It's an interesting country for sure to cover, I'm sure, for the course. There's probably no lack of information in the news and media. Probably easy to come by the information.
Yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah. So it gives us an idea, though, for one particular country. And Greece is not the only country that's in a situation like that. The austerity measures have really come home and have hit hard in a number of countries that are looking at bailouts or potentially even trying to avoid the bailouts. What else has Europe done, though? So the first point there is the Stability Fund, something called is now called the European Stability Mechanism. And again, it has an upper limit of $1 trillion or trillion dollars, I think 700 or 800 billion euros that it's being funded with in the case of additional bailouts. As I mentioned before, Greece is a country. The GDP is about $250, $300 billion. Their debt level's greater than that. But when we start talking about countries like Spain, we're talking about 1.3 trillion, 1.5 trillion. Italy, 1.7 or 8 trillion. We're talking about countries that if Spain and Italy were to default, their debts are larger than the entire size of this bailout fund. And so even the bailout fund wouldn't be enough. And that's where a lot of the fear comes from in the Euro debt crisis, that the fear of contagion, as I mentioned before, that this could spread. What else has Europe done? We've got something called the Fiscal Compact. What is that? That's basically the new and improved version of the Stability and Growth Fund, or Stability and Growth Pact. And so the Stability and Growth Pact that initially was asked for or championed by Germany, then the Germans and the French kind of pressured the EU to kind of lax the regulations because they themselves were running deficits, and became sort of a thorn in the side of Europe because it wasn't enforced. Now the Fiscal Compact has been brought about to try to bring some new teeth and strictness to the fiscal policy guidelines for Europe to try to actually keep deficits and debt in hand. What else has happened? The EU finance ministers recently agreed to some rules on how to use the bailout fund, should they need to, for failing banks. When the fund was created sort of in an emergency a couple of years ago, there weren't a lot of rules or details about how it might actually get implemented and used for banks. Now they're working their way through that. And there's also been some steps taken towards what we call banking union and EU-wide governance of banks to make sure that banks are actually more sound, and that they're regulated in a better way, and that they don't run into these problems down the road of not being well capitalized. So those are some steps that Europe has taken to try to address the crisis. Moving forward, looking kind of to the future now, the present and the future for the EU overall. Well, one of the things that we see, if you look back on the history of Europe and the European Union, is that it tends to actually, Europe tends to move forward and to evolve, kind of lurches forward, if you will, in stages around times of crises. And the crisis tends to be the motivator that brings the political will to make difficult decisions that Europe otherwise isn't able to make. So if you recall earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that when the euro was created, countries were willing to give up control of their monetary policy, their interest rates, and the supply of money, but not their fiscal policy, not taxation and spending. And there was a Stability and Growth Pact, but it didn't have a lot of enforcement. Now, as a result of the crisis, countries in Europe have more political will to actually go forward with deeper integration, including in areas of fiscal policy, taxation and spending, and areas of debt. That's one aspect that we see from Europe overall, is their evolution in integration moves forward out of crisis. Another thing I'll mention on the side is something called optimal currency areas. This is more of an academic theory in economics, championed by a fellow named Robert Mundell. His research work looked at areas of the world economically that are combined under one currency. Are they optimal? If we look at geographical maps, currencies are defined by political boundaries. So you have one currency for a country, and yet regions within that country operate differently. So if we think even about Canada, we have a number of different economic regions. You've got Atlantic Canada, which traditionally has higher rates of unemployment, slower economic growth. We have Western Canada, Alberta in particular, that's booming because of natural resources, oil and gas. You have Ontario and Quebec in the middle of Canada, that in the past was sort of the economic heart of the country, still is to a great extent, but has suffered in the manufacturing industry since the crisis. All those areas have different economic cycles to them, and could probably actually benefit from having different types of currencies and monetary policies to control that. Well, if you take that out now and look at the 18 countries that are in the Eurozone in Europe, it isn't necessarily one homogeneous group or region economically. And the theory of optimal currency areas says that in order to have one region, economic region, that should be under one currency, there should be three sort of core parts to it. One is centralized fiscal policy. The aspect that we just talked about was missing from the European Union when the euro was created. And now there's a little bit more political will to go down that route and actually have some fiscal policy, centralized fiscal policy, control of taxation and spending. Secondly is free movement of labor mobility. And Europe has moved that way now, more recently, in the last few treaties, to allow citizens to move around to different countries, to go leave countries or areas where unemployment is high, and go to regions where there's more jobs. And the third is what he calls an absence of asymmetric shocks, which means that an economy, or all of the areas within an optimal currency area, will respond in a similar way to external shocks, like the financial crisis. Not that the economies will react in different ways. And so the question is the Eurozone, the 18 countries, are they an optimal currency area? Should they actually be all together under one currency? Or are they actually still disparate and separate economic regions that would benefit from different types of monetary policy and interest rates? That's another sort of aspect of the European Union needs to kind of think about going forward. Third one is political will for closer union. Things like fiscal union, common spending. Would it ever come to the point where you actually have the United States of Europe, like we have the United States of America, where Washington decides what the federal government's going to spend for all of the United States? Would it ever come to the point where Europe would allow Brussels to decide how money gets spent for all of the 28 countries in the European Union? What about shared public debt? Would the countries of Europe be willing to actually co-guarantee, mutually guarantee and backstop debt? Banking union, I mentioned that before. Bringing all the banks together under one regulation, governance, deposit insurance. Eurobonds, joint liability, where any countries in the European Union can actually issue bonds, and it's backstopped by all the other countries in the EU, in particular Germany, France, UK, the more wealthy countries. Closer economic union with the intention of returning to growth. That's sort of the idea behind it. Time will tell whether the member states can keep pace and whether integration will happen across Europe in a common way, or whether we might see something that's called TwoSpeed Europe. TwoSpeed Europe is a term that refers to the idea that some states in the European Union might actually integrate deeper or faster, while others are slower or don't integrate to the same extent. If you think about the euro as an example, not all countries in the European Union have the euro currency adopted, so you've got sort of a distinction there between two different groups. Might we see more of that if countries like Greece decide to actually pull back from the euro itself, but still remain within the European Union itself? And lastly, return to economic growth. Will that happen? When will that happen? Well, the news out of Europe, actually, I was looking at something earlier today. Reports say that the Eurozone itself and the European Union has actually returned to economic growth as a whole. Greece has not yet, and individual countries have not, but their economic growth has returned to about 1.5% is what they're projecting right now. There's a quote from one of the Eurocrats at the Commission that said, "The worst of the crisis may now be behind us." That's something you would never have heard in the news a year or two ago. But the problem is the percentage of debt to GDP is still growing. It's continuing to grow. And so the debt problem hasn't gone away. And that's an issue moving forward. As a side note, something I want to mention here is a relation to Canada, the impact with Canada. The picture here is a picture of Prime Minister Harper with the President of the European Commission, Mr. Barroso, and it was taken just a number of months ago when there was ratification of a trade pact called the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. Canada and the European Union have been negotiating this trade pact for, I think, close to 4 years now. And it's quite comprehensive. It's actually more comprehensive than NAFTA in many ways. And originally, the impetus behind it was Canada was realizing that we had a lot of our eggs in our basket with the United States. The vast majority of our exports and our trade happens with the U.S. Well, the U.S. was going through the subprime mortgage crisis and then the financial crisis. They were in recession. Canada, the Canadian government, was looking at alternatives. And so they turned to Europe, and we're looking at having a free trade pact that would expand economic trade opportunities. It's ironic because now there's a debt crisis happening in Europe, and yet Canada is still in the process of moving forward with deeper integration and closer economic ties with Europe. And so we'll see how that plays out. But Canada as well has come out of the financial crisis perhaps in relatively better shape than a lot of other countries, especially in comparison to, let's say, the US. It was one of the only countries in the G8 to go through the crisis without having to bail out our banks. If you think about the big five here in Canada, Royal Bank of Canada, TD, BMO, Scotiabank, none of those banks needed to or asked the federal government for funding in order or for bailout funds in order to make it through the crisis. Partly due to better regulation, but also a more tempered housing market. Our house prices didn't take off the way they did in the US. But what's a little bit unnerving is if you look at it now, our prices also didn't crash. And they're still on an upward trajectory. So there's a little bit of concern about whether we might have our own sort of housing bubble here in Canada and potentially a debt crisis down the road. I want to turn now, that sort of concludes the part of the presentation where we talk about sort of what are the crises and what were the aspects to it. I want to turn now to a couple of points that we'll cover a little bit more briefly. What are some of the practical causes that people say are the causes for the crisis? And then after that, a little bit more sort of philosophical explanations, and then we'll get into a discussion about that. So practical causes, economic, technical causes. Well, it was caused by rampant speculation in the real estate market, leading to boom and bust, what we talked about before, subprime mortgage crisis. Was that the cause of the crisis overall? Was it pay and incentive schemes and structures in banks, mortgage companies, hedge funds? Is that sort of one of the main causes for the crisis? Was it caused by fraudulent lending practices, both by lenders and by borrowers, to have access to funds? Was that a key part of it? Was it the securitization, or what we call the collateralization of the mortgages, when banks resold them in bundles and sort of masked their actual true origin? Was that the cause of it? What about inaccurate credit ratings by agencies? You had a lot of these banks that went bankrupt. Some of them had top credit ratings. So there was a breakdown somewhere in the credit rating system. And also lax regulation by governments of financial industries, but also of governments, especially in Europe with the sovereign debt crisis. Those are some practical causes that are put forward as being the cause for the crisis. But what about philosophical explanations? What about if we look at things like greed and excess of human nature, operating in a system where there's freedom of choice, individual choice, for economic activity? Did greed and excess lead to it? What about deregulated market structure? The fact that there wasn't enough regulation, or perhaps it wasn't enforced enough. Do we need more regulation and a more active role in the state? And that's being discussed as well. You'll see in the news and media and in different circles. What about a lack of ethics and moral leadership in business and society? Could that be one of the root causes as well, or a philosophical place to turn to talk about the debt crisis? What I want to do now is invite Norm to join me in a discussion about a couple of questions. I've got some photocopies. Maybe I'll ask Terry to hand these out to the tables, if you will. I've got 5 questions now that I want us to all think about. And the first 2, I'm going to pose those questions to Norm, and he and I will have a brief discussion about some aspects of investing and the role of trust in investing. And then the other 3 questions, I'd like you as a group, as an audience, to talk about these questions amongst yourselves around the table, and we'll sort of invite you into a wider discussion about those particular questions and also anything else that we've talked about here in our discussion so far. So Norm, question number 1 for you. As a value investor, how would you view the events of the financial crisis over the past few years, and have these events changed your perspective on investing and the outlook on the economic future? How would you respond to that, or how would you discuss that, Norm?
Well, investing implies interaction with the stock market, and we haven't talked a lot about it except early. Jeff introduced it initially to say that Lehman Brothers went bankrupt and various banks were going bankrupt. Well, what really happened there? What happened is that the assets that they held were no longer covering their debt and liabilities. And how did people know that? Well, the fact that the stock market dropped almost 50% had something to do with that, and very directly, because the stock market is what values those assets. So when they no longer were anywhere near the value that they had been said to be, they had a big problem, and that's what made banks insolvent. So, so this clear, Jeff's talked about all the anguish and crisis that this has created on what people call Main Street, like in regular lives of people. But I just want to talk a little bit now about how a value investor views the stock market, and in the process of doing that, I'm going to kind of define, without getting too didactic, what a value investor is in very general terms, I think. So first of all, an investor is kind of a participant observer. You're watching things happen, and you're trying not to do anything really stupid. You're participating in a way, but you're primarily an observer. And I was trained as an anthropologist, and the participant and observation is a big interest there. And now I'm just getting, instead of watching native groups, I like to watch markets as well, and companies and people that are just in mainstream society. So the key thing about stock market is that a value investor views it, the market, as Mr. Market. And Mr. Market is really a manic depressive. He basically does things and prices things on feelings. So if he's having a good day, he comes in, you want to buy his business, he wouldn't sell it to you for anything. You offer him, $1 million, he'll want $1,010,000, and so on. And when he's having a bad day, he'll practically give it to you. He just wants it off his hands. He doesn't want to see it anymore. And when he's being, when he's being treated properly, or he has a normal day, he might even get things about right, like valuing the business about right. So Mr. Market is unpredictable and completely uninformative to a value investor. If you tell me what a stock I own right now is trading at today on the stock market, I could say, well, why would I care what the stock market is saying? Unless I'm looking to buy or looking to sell, I wouldn't trust their number one little bit. It's just an opportunity for a transaction. But if a value investor generally is a long-term investor. So you're trying to buy things when there's real value there, and then sell it when it's becoming overpriced, when people are getting when Mr. Market is getting too euphoric. So you like to buy things when he's depressed and sell things when he's getting giddy. So if you're not getting your pricing and your judgment from the market, where are you getting it from? Well, the first thing a value investor does is separate investment from speculation. We have no interest in speculation. What do we mean by investment? So we get pained when we hear about lottery tickets. It just really, really hurts the value investor. I can physically wince when I see an advertisement from the government about lottery tickets, because that's speculation, and it's guaranteed to lose you money. So value investors aren't interested in that kind of activity. What a value investor wants is invest, and investing has to be intelligent and it has to be rational. And we view investment as most rational when it is most businesslike. So when we're looking at buying a business, we really would like to get some business person who actually understands the business to give us their time and explain it to us in fascinating and lengthy detail. And these people are hard to get because they're busy. But the whole goal, so you can read annual reports, you can read some of the best analysts on it, but generally they're a little bit of a waste of time. And you can read trade reports and things to find out things about the business, and you look at their products, you kick tires, so to speak. So investment is most intelligent when it's most businesslike. And we really try to put on the hat of the businessman and think about the business. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to decide, what is a business worth? And when you're talking, nowadays you hear a lot about different stocks, Facebook, Twitter, a lot of stocks that have next to no earnings, though. Projections of rapidly increasing earnings. Well, value investors don't care at all about projections. They would like 10, 15 years of history. And what we're looking at is profits and sustainability of profits. And that's how we value businesses. And I could give you an example of that in a very specific way, but I'll move on. To make the final point is value investors always look for a margin of safety. Whenever they finally price the business, they say, well, you know, I might have missed something. There might be a recession coming. You know, Putin might decide to do something that could unsettle people. So I want to be kind of careful in my pricing and allow for a margin of safety, just in case my numbers didn't quite add up or there's an unexpected bump in the road. So what is my view on what happened as a value investor? Basically what happened is, you know, Mr. Market temporarily lost his mind. And when the market fell 50%, he was not only throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And it was just the psychological and sociological error in judgment that he made, but collectively we all the participants in the financial market made. That may sound a little high-minded, but that's how we have to think. So it's a very Mennonite thing to be a value investor, because you're looking at things from a contrarian perspective. And the more contrarian your perspective, the more atypical, the less people hold it, the more assured you become that you might be right. And that's a little bit of a joke, but it helps. I mean, it helps to be a Mennonite doing this kind of thing, I think. And the final answer, and I don't know about my time here, but have these events, sorry, the final question was, have these events changed my view?
Yeah, change your perspective on investing and the outlook in the future.
Okay. Well, in a word, no. Not at all. And why is this? It's because, and I'm going to read my note here so I can finish. What we're seeing is a reversion to the mean. Like basically, when this crisis happened, everyone said there's a new normal. In fact, Ford, car sales, people said we'll never again see car sales at the level we saw them in 2007. Well, last year, I think we surpassed that. there's a reversion to the mean. Whenever somebody says it's different this time, a value investor says, odds are probably 95% that you're wrong. Someday the apocalypse will come. Someday the world will end as we know it. But the odds are, under conditions that we can all live with, and if we're fortunate, that there will be a reversion back to the mean. So no, it hasn't changed my view a bit. It's created a lot of nervousness and sadly a lot of pain for people and everyone. But
That's interesting because for many companies, it has fundamentally changed their outlook and how they project the future, how they budget, how they estimate. Everybody talks about sort of pre-crisis, post-crisis, the appetite for risk, all that type of thing. And yet you're saying from a value investor perspective, you look at it and say, based on the principle that I use, it actually doesn't change the outlook. It was an aberration. Things revert back to the mean. And there's things to be learned from it going forward, but it doesn't fundamentally change because your principles weren't based on momentum investing anyways. It wasn't based on speculation. It wasn't based on going through the trends.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. And the thing is, the companies who had to change their perspective and change their whole business, etc., hopefully we were smart enough to avoid in the first place because they were kind of fictive. They were running on some kind of fiction. So, like for example, banks apparently will never be as profitable again. That was one of the things. And banks like Wells Fargo, that's really like a big credit union in some ways, doing a very transaction-based business. I think they're about as profitable as they ever were, and they've actually tripled their assets and their shareholder equity in the last 5 years.
Yeah, that's true even in Canada as well, where some of the banks are actually starting to have record profits now coming out of the crisis.
Right.
Let's move on to the second question, Norm, that I wanted to pose to you because I think it's an interesting one. I mentioned a number of times throughout my presentation where trust was eroded or where it broke down. It broke down with the trust that mortgage holders would make their payments in the US in the subprime mortgage crisis. Trust broke down with banks, the stability of banks and the ability to lend to each other during the financial crisis. Trust broke down within the European Union itself, between the member states, for going forward together in the EU project, but also making their own payments on their national debt. What about the role of trust in value investing? What happens when trust is eroded in the economic system?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is we must all develop some basic economic intelligence as people. You know, I was really, really nervous coming out today because I expected this room to be packed, you know, despite 30 below weather, because I couldn't think of something more important to most people. And yet a lot of people have a very casual, lackadaisical, sloppy attitude about their finances, and they don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about it. So I think that people should accept personal responsibility for their financial situation, decisions they make. But having said that, I think that there are big trust issues. Like one of the biggest problems we have in the financial industry is everyone has to save for retirement. You know, the Marxist prof has got to have a retirement fund to retire. And the capitalist, you know, needs to have one. Everyone needs, if you're going to not work at some point because you can't, you're going to need some way to fund that activity, and it's no longer work. And the problem and most of us turn to mutual funds then, and mutual funds charge money, and most of the financial industry charges money right up front. You know, mutual funds charge about 3% of your return a year. A recent study in The Economist showed, and just to have your money, and that they'll charge that whether you make a penny or not. So there's no link to performance. So how can that not erode trust in the financial community? And but I don't know that even Mennonites doing business in the financial world are doing anything different. I don't see any. I'm looking for somebody tell me where there's a guy where there's companies that are basically organized differently in this way. They're saying, look, I only want to make a penny if I make you 5. I mean, I don't know even of many Mennonites trying to do that. And so yeah, trust. I think that we go a little further later. We have another question on trust, I think the final one. But I really think that just fast forward, we have to apply the golden rule here. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the only guy I actually know who has done that consistently in his life in terms of investment and treating his shareholders like he treats himself is actually Warren Buffett, and his record is very clear, and I won't bore you with his details, except that he hardly charges himself a thing, and if he makes $1, 1% in a year, you make 1% as his investor. I mean, that's a completely, you have to realize how exceptional that is in the industry, and I'd like to see more people doing that. And the other thing is, the Bible says, don't look only after your own interests, but after also the interests of others. I think financial stuff should be a priestly duty. The accountant who developed it, if I'm right, lived in Venice, and he was a monk. The accounting system, the double entry accounting system. So there's a priestliness, and yet you see all this wanton greed where people just can never have enough money, even though you wonder what they ever do with it. So, I don't know, I'm rambling.
I take it you wouldn't be buying a subprime mortgage housing anytime soon. It's all speculation, right? You stay away from that.
Sorry.
No, basically just saying that you stayed completely away from the whole subprime mortgage thing in terms of investing and whatnot.
Yeah, I even stayed away from Nortel because Nortel was creating a commodity product, basically optical cable, that everybody and their dog was capable of making if they had enough skill. Corning, other companies. And that was really their growth business, and it was just a commodity product. So you want to avoid, any time an asset class jumps for 15 years, goes just up, 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 up. Like capitalism, what you see over and over is asset classes cycle to extremes. That's one of the things we do badly, perhaps, in capitalism. But I've never, even just 2 years ago, in the US, everyone thought house prices were going down. In Canada, they all thought they were going up. And I think, I haven't met a Canadian yet, and if you're out there, tell me, you're really worried about Canadian house prices. But in US, they're still worried. And one day, our asset class that's been going up for 15, 20 years now, what do you think the next direction is, rationally speaking?
Could be quite down. The thing about trust, I think that's interesting, is there's two aspects where trust can be eroded. One is when somebody says something and you base your expectations on that, and you anticipate that their actions are going to line up with their words, and then they don't. So that's an area where trust gets eroded. But trust also gets eroded when someone has well intentions. Someone is saying something, and they have all intentions of actually carrying that out, but because of circumstances beyond their control, they're not able to. And trust also gets eroded that way, when it's not that you don't believe what they're saying, it's you don't believe they have the ability to actually carry it out. And I think both of those come into play when we talk about the crisis and what happened here in the last couple of years. And I think it's an interesting thing to talk about, especially when we look at it in the context here of an institution like CMU, talking about faith-based and Christian principles of trust. Trust is at the foundation, at the core of a lot of aspects. And I think if you look at the heart of some of the hubris, if you will, the word that was used in the video, where the subprime mortgage speculation, the rampant speculation, predatory lending even, that sort of term, there wasn't a lot of trust there even, because people were sort of caught up in the momentum. And trust was a little bit secondary. And when trust then started to get eroded, either because people weren't lining up with their actions or because situations outside of their control, That's where you had the shock. And I think if we look at Europe as well, the debt crisis was another situation where people weren't expecting that. And what we'll probably find, sort of as a concluding point on the Euro debt crisis situation in Greece, is that over time, as people start to readjust their expectations of Greece and their expectations of what's going to happen with Greece staying in or out of the Eurozone, in and out of the European Union itself, then there'll be less shock to the system. And as Europe works through some of those steps, that this crisis might fade. But it leads us to the next question. Will this be the last crisis? And the reality is probably not. And this isn't the only crisis. If we can look back in history, and crises happen on a regular basis. And why is that? It's because you have euphoria in the marketplace. You have rampant speculation in housing prices, in government bonds. You can go back to the Asian debt crisis, Latin American debt crisis. There's different aspects. The tulip bulb speculation in Holland years ago, centuries ago. So trust, I think, is an important thing. And how does it get reinstated? It takes time, and there's usually new expectations and new avenues of proving that trust. I want to switch now to the last three questions here, which I'm going to actually walk through in succession. I'll walk through each of these and mention them to you, speak them out to you, and ask that you spend a couple minutes around the table or with people that you're comfortable with discussing one of them, two of them, or maybe all of them. And then we'll give a couple minutes for open discussion and question, Q&A, with our group here and with each other about some of these topics. One is, are debt levels too high in Canada? Overall as a country, our national debt, but also as individuals and families. Are we sort of next in line at some point? Is Canada going to have a crisis because of our debt levels, if debt was a core aspect of it, of the crisis? Number two, is regulation, greater regulation, the answer? Or does regulation lead to a system of compliance where the state acts as a substitute for our own conscience and our own moral leadership? And I want to finish with question number three here. Is actually a quote from Paul Williams, who's the chair of Marketplace Theology at Regent College in Vancouver. His question he poses is, how can you and I live and work so that our actions, our moral leadership, and our Christian principles will be part of the solution rather than part of the contributing to the problem? That our lives and our moral leadership will actively witness to a different story for our world and for our economy. When we're talking about things like debt, excessive debt, speculation, lack of trust, carrying through with our actions, when we talk about aspects of ethics and values in business and justice within a business context, and also focusing on relationships. Those are all aspects of moral leadership. When leadership and business principles are based on those principles just as much or even more so, and as a complement, not as a substitute, but as a complement with concerns about economic well-being, financial decision-making. Okay, so you've got copies of these questions on your table, because I'm not able to post all three of them, or all five, if you include the two that I posed to Norm. And I'll give a couple minutes for you to discuss amongst yourselves with each other these questions, but also post some questions to our group here and to each other. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that.